The snows kept falling, turning Winterfell's ancient walls white under the pale morning sun. Dawn revealed the cost of the night's bloodshed. Bodies strewn in the courtyard, streaks of frozen crimson marking where men had fallen. Jon Snow, now hailed as the king in the north, surveyed the grim scene from a tower window. His reflection looked back at him in the wavy glass, a tired face framed by dark hair. His wounded arm throbbed, wrapped hastily in a linen bandage that needed changing. He should have been resting. Instead, he stood alone, mind churning with the tasks that waited. He had not slept. Instead, he and his advisors had spent what remained of the night settling the chaos within Winterfell's walls, ensuring no hidden pockets of Bolton men lingered. There had been some fighting in the crypts, a handful of Ramsay's most fanatical loyalists trying to hide among the dead, but Mors Umber's men flushed them out swiftly. By first light, the castle was secure. Roose Bolton's line, at least here, was broken. Sentries patrolled the ramparts, where tattered Stark banners now flew in defiance of the snow-laden sky. Jon inhaled slowly and stepped back from the window, though his heart tugged him to the crypts, his father's tomb, the place where the bones of House Stark rested. He could not linger in grief. Not yet. Too many living souls demanded guidance. The corridor was nearly empty as he made his way to the great hall, limping slightly from bruises on his legs. Ghost trailed behind him, the direwolf's white fur blending with the dusting of snow that had found its way indoors. A pair of spearmen stationed at the doors hastily saluted. Jon gave them a short nod and entered the hall. Inside, the high windows admitted weak winter light that gleamed on the newly stoked fires in the hearths. The stench of battle hung in the air, blood, burned flesh, and fear. Men in Stark livery moved about, carrying out the wounded on makeshift litters or sweeping debris from the fight. Mors Umber's deep voice boomed from one corner, barking orders to his subordinates. Lady Alice Karstark, her face drawn but resolute, conferred with a pair of Karstark soldiers near the dais. Tormund Giantsbane was nowhere in sight, likely inspecting the castle walls or haranguing the newly captured Bolton prisoners. When Jon entered, Alice took note and quickly approached, cloak swirling around her ankles. "Your Grace," she said, voice hushed. She looked him over, concern flickering in her eyes at the sight of his bandaged arm and the dried blood on his leather coat. "Have you had any rest?" "I will," Jon replied, though he doubted it. "What's our situation?" Alice drew in a breath and began to list what had been learned overnight. Ramsay Bolton's command had numbered around 300 men. Most were slain or captured, some scattered into the winter darkness beyond the walls. Scouts had been sent out at daybreak to track down stragglers. The Bolton officers who survived were locked in a storeroom under guard, awaiting Jon's judgment. Provisions within Winterfell were modest. Ramsay had not fully restocked the larder, but there was enough to last a month or two if rationed carefully. "We'll need more," Alice said, "especially if we're to hold the castle and accept new arrivals." Jon nodded. He imagined the harsh roads to the south, snow-choked and treacherous. Even in the best weather, carts hauling grain or livestock would struggle. "We'll have to send for supplies from houses willing to support us, White Harbor, or maybe Bear Island. But we can't count on swift deliveries in this weather." Alice's lips tightened. "The Mormonts might help if they've not already been squeezed by the Boltons. The Manderlys? That's the key, isn't it?" Jon knew it was so. White Harbor was the largest city in the north, the seat of House Manderly, and it boasted a port that could, if the seas weren't locked in ice, receive trade from the south or even Essos. If Lord Wyman Manderly declared for Jon, it would not only provide badly needed food and coin, but also encourage fence-sitting houses to follow. But forging such an alliance would be delicate. The Manderlys had old grudges against certain houses, and they had never forgotten the murder of their kin by the Freys. Jon exhaled slowly. "If we want White Harbor, we need to show them that the Starks are truly returned, that we hold Winterfell in more than name." Alice glanced around at the battered hall. "We do hold Winterfell now, but the Iron Throne won't be pleased." Jon's gaze hardened. "Let them come. We'll show them that the North remembers." Alice inclined her head, half a bow, and withdrew to see to other matters. Jon turned back toward the dais where a single chair, the old high seat, waited. It was carved from oak, adorned with direwolf sigils. Once, Ned Stark had sat there to mete out justice and welcome petitioners from across the north. Jon felt a pang. He remembered standing beside Robb in this hall, both of them hardly tall enough to see over the table. Now, the seat was his by right of Robb's final decree. The thought still felt surreal. He stepped forward and settled onto the seat. The hall workers paused in their tasks, dipping their heads or bowing as they passed, newly mindful of the presence of their king. For a time, Jon simply watched, absorbing the swirl of activity and grief around him. A boy no older than 14 cleared away broken timbers. 2 men struggled to carry a limp body on a stretcher. A swirl of memory engulfed him. Times he had stood in these halls as a nameless bastard, overshadowed by noble siblings, longing to be recognized as part of the family. Life had turned in such strange ways that now he claimed the seat in the name of House Stark. He wished for just a moment he could set aside duty and slip down to the kitchens, have a stolen cup of ale with PYP or Gren or Tollet, laughing at some foolish joke. That boy was gone. In his place sat a man with a realm to protect. Eventually, a group of soldiers approached, escorting a cluster of prisoners. At their head was a gaunt, bearded man in torn Bolton livery. He reeked of sweat and dried blood. The soldier in charge bowed sharply to Jon. "Your Grace," he said, "we found these men cowering in the cellars. Some are Bolton soldiers. Others might be servants." One of the prisoners, a trembling youth, looked up with haunted eyes. "We're just stable hands," he quavered. "We had no part in the fighting. And my father's a small folk farmer near the Dreadfort. We were pressed into service." Jon studied him. The lad looked starved, and his clothes were threadbare. "What do you say?" Jon asked, addressing the group. "Anyone here with blood on his hands will face justice. Those who served under Ramsay Bolton out of fear or compulsion. I will not punish if you swear never to raise arms against House Stark again. If that is a lie, the old gods will know." He remembered how his father used to handle such matters, direct but fair. A single line from Ned Stark often decided a man's fate. Yet Ned would also show mercy when he believed it deserved. Jon would do the same. He was no Ramsay, nor even a Robb who had once executed Lord Karstark in the heat of war. Jon's sense of justice guided him to judge each on their actions. Some insisted they were forced. A few stammered confessions of lesser crimes. Others refused to speak at all. In the end, Jon singled out those likely guilty of heinous acts, torture, murder of innocents, and ordered them taken to the dungeon. The rest would be put to work rebuilding the damage done to Winterfell. Before the soldiers led them off, Jon made each kneel and repeat an oath that they would not bear arms against House Stark or seek vengeance. It was a solemn moment, the old gods invoked in the hush of the hall. The stable hand's voice quavered, but he spoke the words, tears streaking his cheeks. Once done, the group was taken away, leaving the hall quieter and still heavy with unspoken tension. Mors Umber approached next, his heavy steps echoing. He sank into a partial bow, though it was more a dip of his head. "Your Grace," he greeted. "There's a rider come from our scouts. Seems a party of Freys was traveling north a ways behind Ramsay's lines. The scouts say they've turned tail and run for the King's Road after hearing about our victory." Jon's jaw tightened at the mention of Freys. "Do they pose an immediate threat?" Mors shook his head. "Likely not. Our men gave chase, but they had a good start. They might be heading to the Twins or maybe back to wherever they came from to carry word of your success to Walder Frey. The old weasel won't be pleased." The thought of Walder Frey's response brought a bitter taste to Jon's mouth. The Red Wedding was forever a stain on the honor of House Frey, a betrayal that had ripped the North apart. If Walder now learned that Winterfell was reclaimed by a Stark, by Robb's chosen heir, he might scheme anew. Still, Jon doubted the Freys could mount a full-scale invasion on their own. They depended on the Lannisters for the crown's favor. "Let them run," Jon decided. "We have bigger concerns than chasing a few Freys through the snow." If they return in force, we'll meet them with steel. Mors grinned fiercely. We'll string them up for robbing us of the great Jon, he growled, then turned on his heel to continue his duties. Jon knew Mors's rage. The great Jon had been captured at the Red Wedding. His fate remained unknown, but rumors said he was rotting in a Fry dungeon. Perhaps, when time allowed, they could attempt a rescue. But for now, the North needed to solidify its strength. Jon rose from the seat, ignoring the protest of his aching limbs. He had spent enough time in the hall. Other tasks beckoned. Ghost padded beside him, quiet as a snowfall, as he made his way to the courtyard. He found Tormund Giantsbane near the stables, engaged in a heated argument with a half-frozen man who wore an old Night's Watch cloak. "Don't spit your Southron nonsense at me," Tormund was snarling. "I've trudged through more snow than you've got hairs on your chin. If I say we can gather wood beyond the ridge, then that's what we'll do." Jon stopped, brow creasing. "What's this about?" he asked. The man in the watch cloak turned quickly, relief crossing his face at the sight of Jon. "Lord Commander," the man began, then paused, remembering Jon had laid aside that title. "Forgive me, Your Grace. We are short on firewood and Tormund wants to send a party beyond the ridge to gather more. But it's dangerous. Some of Ramsay's men may have fled that way. There could be bandits." Tormund glowered. "I know how to handle a few stray kneelers. The real danger is freezing to death if we don't have enough wood. Or are we going to burn the furniture in your fancy castle? Let me take a band of wildlings. We'll be back by nightfall with enough wood to keep the fires going for days." Jon raised a hand to calm them. "He's right about needing supplies, but be cautious. Take a few good fighters. Watch for ambushes." Tormund huffed but nodded. "And take at least 2 men who know the terrain. Someone local. I won't have you lost in a blizzard." As Tormund stomped off to gather volunteers, Jon turned to the man in the black cloak. He recognized him. Harker was his name, a ranger who had stayed loyal to Jon even after he stepped away from the watch. A handful of such men had followed Jon, believing his cause served a greater good than simply manning the wall. Jon placed a hand on Harker's shoulder. "You and any other men of the watch are free to go back if you wish. I'd not hold you from your vows." Harker shook his head. "We made our choice. After we saw you named in that will and saw what the Boltons were doing, it was time to take a stand. And if the others truly come, maybe the best way to fight them is to ensure the North is united under a Stark." He paused. "But do you think the Watch will ever forgive us, Your Grace?" Jon sighed. "The Watch must remain neutral in the realm's wars. You did what you felt was right. We'll sort out the rest when the dead come knocking." He forced a small smile. "Keep your eyes open, and help Tormund keep his men in line. He listens to me, sometimes, but he's headstrong. If there's danger, don't be heroes. Get back here safe." Harker bowed. "As you say." He hurried off, leaving Jon alone in the swirling snow. Jon looked around the courtyard. Bits of debris and broken weapons still littered the ground. Patches of blood stained the once pristine drifts. A group of men worked to haul bodies into a mass burial pit beyond the outer walls. Both Bolton and Stark loyalists would share the same cold ground, as there was no time for individual burials. The stench of death lingered. Overhead, crows circled, black shapes against a white sky. A chill deeper than winter spread through Jon's bones. This was only the beginning. War was a hungry beast. The peace he had known at the wall was harsh, but simpler. Duty there was clear. Defend the realm from whatever emerged from the cold dark beyond. Now he faced the twisted complexities of politics, revenge, and alliances. Yet he could not regret obeying Robb's will. The Boltons' tyranny had to end. Winterfell had to be reclaimed. If only he could do so without losing more of his people. He sighed and crossed to a group of Karstark archers who were warming themselves by a small brazier. They saluted him, eyes shining with newfound purpose. He asked about their supplies, learning that many of their bows were in poor shape, the strings frayed from damp conditions. Some had only a handful of arrows left. The victory at Winterfell had been a desperate gamble, and though they had succeeded, they were ill-equipped for a prolonged campaign. We'll find more bows or craft them if we must, Jon promised. For now, gather any you can salvage from the battlefield. Reclaim arrows from the walls. We can fletch them anew. They nodded eagerly, grateful for direction. As Jon moved on, he nearly collided with a pair of small folk carrying a stretcher. On it lay a wounded man, moaning softly. His leg was badly mangled. Jon knelt quickly and pressed a hand to the man's shoulder. The soldier's eyes fluttered open, pupils dilated with pain. "It'll be all right," Jon said. A quiet promise he wasn't certain he could keep. "We have a maester?" The small folk looked at each other uneasily. "There is no maester here," the woman said, voice trembling. "The Boltons had one, but he fled when the fighting started." Jon closed his eyes briefly, cursing under his breath. "Take him to the hall. We have bandages, some poultices. Do the best you can. Tell them I sent you, that this man is to be cared for first." They hurried off, the soldiers' agonized breathing echoing in the courtyard. Jon's chest tightened. For all the grandeur of declaring a king, this was the reality of war. Men crying out in pain, limbs lost, families mourning. If he was to lead them, he needed a proper maester, a supply of medicines, a system to treat the wounded. For the moment, though, that was just another line in a list of urgent needs. A brief commotion near the gates drew his attention. A horse and rider pushed through the drifted snow, the rider swaying in the saddle. The man bore no sigil, but he wore heavier armor, mud-streaked and battered. As he approached, the guards leveled spears, demanding he dismount. The rider raised empty hands. "I come in peace," he called, voice hoarse. "I have a message for Jon Snow, or King Jon, if that's what they call him." Jon nodded for the guards to stand aside. He stepped forward, Ghost beside him, and studied the messenger. The man's face was hollow-cheeked, as if he had ridden without rest for days. "Speak," Jon said. The messenger drew a scroll from his belt pouch, sealed with black wax. "I was told to deliver this to the Lord Commander at Castle Black. But word is that you're no longer at the wall." Jon's throat constricted. A letter addressed to the Lord Commander? His mind flicked to the Night's Watch, the men he'd left behind, the threat of the others. He recognized that black seal, the Watch's crest. "Who gave you this?" "A ranger at Eastwatch," the man replied. "He said it came by Raven from the Shadow Tower first, then was relayed." "I'm just a courier. I rode as fast as I could after they told me you'd marched on Winterfell. Didn't expect to find a battle. My horse is nearly spent." Jon motioned him to dismount. The man slid off the saddle and sank to his knees, half from exhaustion. A stable hand darted forward to take the horse. Jon took the scroll, noticing the black wax had been impressed with the dire wolf of House Stark on top of the Night's Watch shield. Carefully, he broke the seal. His pulse hammered as he scanned the lines, which were in a hasty, barely legible script. The letter was from Bowen Marsh, who had assumed the role of acting Lord Commander after Jon stepped down. Marsh was no friend to Jon, but the tone of the letter was urgent and dire. The wildlings who had crossed through the wall at Jon's invitation were uneasy, but that was not the main concern. Patrols beyond the wall had sighted fresh whites roaming the forest, often in larger groups than before. Hardhome's ruins still crawled with the dead, and occasional sightings of White Walkers were reported near the frozen shore. The letter begged for any reinforcements or assistance Jon could spare, though Marsh made a pointed remark that the Watch was neutral in the wars of the realm. Nonetheless, the danger was growing, and if something wasn't done, the Watch might be overrun when the others finally struck in force. Jon's hand clenched around the parchment. The others would not wait for him to secure the north. They would come, unstoppable as the tide, and the squabbles of lords and kings would mean nothing. He thought of his vow. "I am the sword in the darkness, the watcher on the walls." Could he still claim those words now that he'd crowned himself king? And yet the letter was a cry for help, no matter the bitterness Marsh felt toward him. If the others advanced, the entire north would burn. He turned to the messenger. "Rest. Eat. I'll have men find you a bed." The man mumbled thanks, near collapse. Jon beckoned to a nearby guard, instructing him to see to the courier's needs. Then he reread the letter, his mind in turmoil. Should he call his banners and march again? Abandon Winterfell so soon? That was impossible. He had only just seized the castle. The north was not fully secured. Other houses had yet to declare. And if he marched the entire force north, leaving Winterfell vulnerable, the Boltons or the Freys, perhaps even the Crown's forces, could retake it in a heartbeat. As if conjured by these dark thoughts, Mors Umber arrived, followed by Alice Karstark, both wearing grave expressions. They had heard some whisper that a message from the wall had come. Jon held out the parchment, allowing them to read. Alice's face paled. "Gods be good," she whispered. "The dead gather." Mors growled low in his throat. "We can't fight a war on two fronts, one with swords, one with the others. If the cold corpses come, the North needs to stand together, or we're all done." Jon listened, tension coiling in his gut. Mors was right, but how to unify the North quickly? How to ensure the southern threat wouldn't slip in while they were busy confronting the real enemy? If only he could count on the rest of Westeros to see reason. But he had no illusions that the Iron Throne would rush to assist him. Cersei Lannister, if she still held power, would hardly care about northern troubles. He took a steadying breath. "We must shore up our defenses here and gather more houses under the Stark ban. Now, once we have enough strength, we'll send some men to reinforce the wall, or at least coordinate with the Night's Watch. They might not want my direct leadership, but they can't turn away warriors if the threat is real." Mors grunted in assent. "Aye, that's the only way, and word of your victory here should bring more lords out of hiding. You'll need to write to Lord Manderly soon, try to secure White Harbor." Alice glanced at the letter again. "Ramsay is dead, but Roose Bolton still lives, and he is cunning. He may rally forces from the Dreadfort or from the south. If we don't move swiftly, House Bolton may yet strike back before we're strong enough to deal with the others." The knot in Jon's chest tightened further. Every route forward seemed precarious. Yet he had come this far by following the fundamental principle taught to him by Ned Stark. Do what is right, even if it is hard. Right now, that meant securing the North to face the undead threat. He silently vowed that he would not let petty ambitions distract him from the real war, the war for the living. "We'll do what we can to keep an eye on Roose," Jon said. "If need be, we'll strike at the Dreadfort before he can muster. But first we consolidate. We prepare Winterfell to withstand a siege. And we reach out to the lords." Mors thumped his chest. "The Umbers will do our part. We've a score of riders heading out to contact our cousin up at the last hearth. If we can hold the road, we might get more men down here." Jon nodded. "Good. Lady Alice, you'll handle Carhold." She lowered her gaze. "Carhold is complicated, Your Grace. My uncle was determined to marry me off to cement his claim. If he still holds the castle, my loyalties to you will have made me a traitor in his eyes. But I will try to rally those who remain loyal to our true bloodline. My father supported House Stark before he died. I hope some of his men still do." Jon laid a hand gently on her shoulder, empathy in his eyes. "I'm sorry. I know it can't be easy to go against your own kin, but we'll support you. If your uncle is bent on helping the Boltons, we may have no choice but to displace him." She took a shaky breath. "I understand, Your Grace. I won't falter." Mors excused himself, stepping away to see to the dispatch of letters and to fortify the gates. Alice remained, her expression resolute but tinged with sadness. "I never thought I'd see the day my family would fight among themselves like this," she admitted softly. "But the Boltons, they poison everything they touch." Jon offered a small, grim smile. "Let's hope we can cleanse that poison. And soon." After she left, Jon tucked the Night's Watch letter into his belt. He gazed up at the gray sky overhead, where the crows still circled. The wind carried the scent of smoke and pine. He felt a glimmer of determination stir within him, cutting through the weight of sorrow. He had made his choice, accepting Robb's will, seizing Winterfell. Now came the next part of that choice. Leading, protecting, forging alliances, and preparing for the winter to come. The hours that followed were a relentless rush of tasks. Jon convened his captains to finalize watch rotations, ensuring the walls were manned day and night. He insisted on patrolling the ramparts himself, speaking quietly with the men stationed there. Their breath plumed in the cold air, their cheeks ruddy. Their loyalty and hope were pinned on Jon's leadership. He promised them that help would come, that White Harbor would not remain idle, that House Stark would restore order to the north. They believed him, some with bright eyes, some with grim acceptance. He visited the stables to check on the horses, wincing at the sight of so few healthy mounts. Ramsay's men had abused many of them, and some had been stolen in the chaos of the night. A stable boy with a bandaged hand shyly told Jon that at least a dozen were salvageable. Jon ordered better feeding regimens, though their grain supply was limited. Every resource was stretched thin. In a corner of the stable, he found Tormund's group prepping to leave for their foraging expedition. The wildling leader wore a massive fur cloak, face lit with excitement at the prospect of being out in the wild again. He bared his teeth in a grin when he spotted Jon. "You sure you don't want to come along, Snow?" Tormund joked. "Better than skulking about in this big stone tomb." Jon smiled faintly, exhaustion tugging at him. "Somehow, I don't think the men would appreciate their king wandering off to chop wood. Go, and come back safe." Tormund snorted. "King, you'll never stop being a crow to me." He clapped Jon's good shoulder, then mounted his horse. His band of a dozen or so men followed, including a couple of the younger Karstarks, who apparently wanted to prove themselves. They rode out, their silhouettes disappearing into the swirling white landscape beyond Winterfell's walls. Jon remained by the stable door for a moment, watching until the last flicker of Tormund's cloak vanished into the distance. With the departure, a hush fell over the yard, as if the castle were holding its breath. Wind whispered around the towers. He trudged through the snow back toward the keep, thinking he might finally take a moment to change his bandage and have some food. Before he could reach the door, a stocky soldier in the patched surcoat of House Serwyn hurried up to him, face flushed with cold. "Your Grace, a woman at the gate is asking for you. Says she's from Bear Island. She's alone." Jon's eyebrows lifted. House Mormont of Bear Island had always been fiercely loyal to House Stark. He remembered Lady Meage Mormont, who had once fought beside Robb. She had been one of the signatories to Robb's will, if Jon recalled correctly. Could this be one of her kin? "Bring her in," Jon said. "Make sure she's not harmed." The soldier nodded and beckoned for Jon to follow. By the time Jon reached the gate, the new arrival was already inside, stamping snow from her boots. She was tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs, with a bearskin cloak that framed a stern, wind-burned face. Her hair was gray-brown, pulled back in a single thick braid. She carried a long spear with a worn leather grip. Her eyes flicked immediately to Jon. "Jon Snow," she greeted, voice low and firm, though Jon thought he heard a hint of relief behind it. "I am Daisy Mormont, daughter of the late Lady Meage. I've come with a message from my sisters." Jon regarded her, remembering the name. "I heard you fought at the Whispering Wood with Robb. You served him well." She inclined her head. "I did, and I'd have followed him to the Trident if he'd asked. But the Freys saw to it that we never got that far." Her voice turned bitter at the mention of the Freys. Then she drew herself up. "I have word from Bear Island. My mother, Lady Meage, is missing in the west, last I heard, and so the island is overseen by my sister Lyanna. We received rumors that you had reclaimed Winterfell. Some of our scouts confirmed the news. Bear Island stands with House Stark, and we've made ready as many warriors as we can spare. They await my signal." Jon's heart lifted slightly. The Mormonts might not be numerous, but their reputation was formidable. "Your mother was one of Robb's greatest supporters. Without her, Bear Island has carried on her loyalty." "Thank you." Daisy nodded. "We are your bannermen, Your Grace, if you'll have us. But there's something you should know. We encountered ravens from the Dreadfort. Roose Bolton is calling men to rally. He means to strike soon, and we fear he's mustering not only his own forces but possibly some sellswards from across the narrow sea. There are rumors of Ironborn as well, though I cannot confirm. House Mormont is prepared to send you 200 warriors. Every spare blade we have. If we can find a way to ensure they won't be cut off or destroyed before joining you." She paused, surveying the battered walls of Winterfell. It seems the castle stands, but not without scars. Jon's mind raced. 200 warriors from Bear Island would be a boon, but if Bolton mustered a larger host, we've the Umbers, the Karstarks who remain loyal, some Glovers. We're sending word to White Harbor, but we need time, and if Roose Bolton marches soon, we might not get that time. Daisy blew out a breath, white fog swirling around her face. Then we must make sure he cannot crush us piece by piece. Bear Island is ready, but we cannot fight alone. Send me back with a strategy. Tell me how you'd have us move. If I can slip out again by night, I'll cross the Bay of Ice by boat to return home. Our people know those waters better than any crow. Then we'll sail or march as you command." Jon considered. The Bay of Ice was treacherous in winter, but the Mormonts were indeed skilled seafarers. With White Harbor in question, Bear Island might provide a maritime route for supplies. However, that would demand risk. Patrolling the coast in winter storms was no small feat. Tell your sister. Tell all your kin that I accept their pledge gladly. Bear Island will always have a place in the Stark fold. As for strategy, we need to link up as soon as possible. If the Dreadfort's armies are on the move, we'll want to force a confrontation on ground of our choosing, not let them besiege us here. Let me speak with my advisors. We'll have a plan by tonight. Daisy inclined her head. I'll wait for your word. And one more thing, Roose Bolton is rumored to be in the vicinity of Moat Cailin, or at least near the neck. If that's so, he might push north quickly or he might entrench. If he sets up a strong position near the Fever River, he could block any approach from Bear Island side. We must be cautious. Jon clenched his jaw. Already, the puzzle of war was tightening around them. Understood. The soldier who had brought Daisy in led her to the great hall for warmth and a meal. Jon lingered near the gate, gazing out at the vast whiteness. Somewhere out there, Tormund was chopping wood. The Boltons were gathering new armies. The White Walkers stirred beyond the wall. It was too easy to feel dwarfed by all these threats converging like wolves on wounded prey. He turned back inside, shoulders heavy with the burdens of kingship. Word that Roose Bolton was moving forced his hand. The uneasy lull after Ramsay's defeat would not last. If Bolton struck soon, with a host large enough, Winterfell's battered garrison might not withstand a siege. Jon had only one advantage, the deep loyalty that many in the north still felt for the name Stark. If he could gather them quickly, he might outnumber Bolton or at least force him to fight on unfavorable ground. But orchestrating such unity in the midst of winter required cunning. Starks were said to be straightforward, but sometimes cunning was the only recourse left. He spent much of the afternoon locked in strategy discussions with Mors Umber, Alys Karstark, Daisy Mormont, and a few of the lesser lords who had already sworn fealty. Maps of the north were unrolled across a long table in the solar, candlelight revealing the intricate topography. Their breath fogged the air in the unheated chamber. Points were marked for the last hearth, Deepwood Motte, Carhold, the Dreadfort, Moat Cailin, and White Harbor. If Bolton marches from Moat Cailin with even 1,000 men, we'll need to meet him before he can swell his numbers, Mors argued, jabbing a thick finger at the map. We strike near the Salt Spear or even Torrens Square. Fight him in the open where the Boltons' flaying ways can't sow terror among the small folk. Alys shook her head. That could overextend us. Winterfell's walls might be our best defense. The Boltons can't simply waltz in. And if we meet them in open battle and lose, the war ends right there. Daisy Mormont folded her arms. Bear Island can land men at Deepwood Motte if the seas allow. We'd then push east toward Winterfell, forcing Bolton to contend with a second front. But only if White Harbor commits can we form a true pincer. They all looked to Jon, who studied the map with furrowed brows. Every plan carried risk, yet the north was too vast to guard every approach. We should keep Winterfell as our primary base, he finally said. But we cannot simply hole up behind these walls and hope to starve Bolton out. He'll ravage the countryside, sowing terror to draw us out. We should aim to gather the maximum strength here, in the heart of the north. Then, if Bolton advances, we can choose our ground. Perhaps we can even draw him north of Winterfell if we threaten the Dreadfort. A two-pronged approach might work. One force at Winterfell, another marching toward Bolton's seat to pin him between us. He looked at Defy. If Bear Island's troops can land at Deepwood Motte or somewhere nearby and approach the Dreadfort from the west, it may force Bolton to abandon and advance on Winterfell. Mors nodded slowly. That's a plan, but it hinges on the weather and the sea passage being favorable. And on the assumption Bolton doesn't just ignore that threat, or has enough men to split his forces. Alice frowned. Every day we delay is a day Bolton can bribe or coerce more houses. Some may side with him out of fear or greed. Jon felt the tension in the air. We'll send out more ravens tonight. I'll write to Lord Manderly personally, urging him to join us. And to each house we know might be swayed. The truth of Bolton's deeds at the Red Wedding, the atrocities by Ramsay, these must be laid bare. I'll also mention the threat of the others, though I doubt that will convince many. Most lords still think the White Walkers are a myth. He rubbed his temples. But we have to try. Meanwhile, Defy, you'll take a sealed letter back to Bear Island with my official approval for your sister to land forces at Deepwood Motte if the seas permit. Mors, have your riders warn the Umbers to stand by for possible movement toward the Dreadfort. Alice. He paused, unsure how best to handle her situation. I need you here, but if we're to bring Carhold's men in, we might need you there. Her cheeks colored, but her voice was steady. My uncle controls the castle. I'd be risking my life if I return. But if I don't, Carhold's loyalty is lost. I have distant cousins there, some who might still respect the rightful lady of the house. The question is, can I convince them to oust my uncle? Jon leaned against the table, meeting her gaze. We can send a small contingent with you, enough to protect you, not enough to look like an invasion. If your uncle yields, we take Carhold without bloodshed. If he resists, we'll handle that swiftly. But you must be prepared for either. She set her jaw. I am prepared. The Karstarks have been loyal to the Starks for generations. I won't let one bitter man break that bond. They continued refining their plans, the candles burning low. By the time they finished, the skies outside had darkened, and the temperature dropped further. They parted with solemn nods, each burdened by fresh responsibilities. Jon remained behind, the map spread before him, the flicker of candlelight dancing across the lines of rivers and roads. Ghost lay at his feet, occasionally letting out a soft rumble as if sensing Jon's unease. Jon's gaze wandered to the letter from the Night's Watch, tucked in his belt. A new wave of guilt crested within him. He could see the shape of the war in the north, but how did he also account for the threat beyond the wall? Could he truly muster an army to fight the dead while the living threatened to tear each other apart? The old question returned. Had he made the right choice by accepting Robb's will, or had he doomed them all to a divided front in the face of the others? A gentle knock startled him from his thoughts. Samwell Tarly stepped into the room, cheeks red from the cold. He closed the door, rubbing his hands for warmth. Jon felt a surge of relief. Sam's presence was like a fleeting reminder of better times, of friendship and trust. Jon, Sam said softly, I thought you might need me. Jon waved him closer, a faint smile twitching at his lips. I'm always glad to see you, Sam. How are you holding up? Sam gave a small shrug. I'm well enough. Busy with the wounded, the letters. I do what I can. And, I was hoping to speak to you about this. He held up a battered leather tome, bits of parchment sticking out. It's a record from Maester Luwin's library, detailing the histories of Winterfell's fortifications and supply lines. I found it while rummaging through the crates they piled up after the Boltons burned part of the library. It might be helpful for planning, especially if we expect a siege. Jon's eyes lit up with quiet gratitude. Thank you. Anything that gives us an advantage will be worth its weight in gold. Sam set the book down, flipping it open. It discusses how, In centuries past, Winterfell maintained hidden granaries throughout the land for times of famine or siege. Some might still exist if they weren't all looted or lost. Also, there are references to an older tunnel system beneath the castle, older than the ones you might already know. Possibly, that's how Theon Greyjoy once seized Winterfell. If we can find and fortify those tunnels, it might make infiltration harder for enemies. Jon nodded, leaning over the pages. The lettering was cramped and faded. He could almost see Maester Luwin hunched over a desk, pen scratching as he recorded the old knowledge. I'll have to pass this on to the men in charge of repairs. Thank you, Sam. They stood there a moment in companionable silence. Then Sam cleared his throat. Jon, I also wanted to ask. The letter from the Watch. I heard it arrived. Is it as dire as people say? Jon exhaled, passing a hand over his face. Yes, they're seeing more whites. White walkers near the coast. Marsh begs for help, but also demands we remember the Watch's neutrality. It's complicated. Sam lowered his gaze. I see. We always knew the real war was up there. Do you think we'll be able to help them before it's too late? I don't know, Jon admitted, voice heavy with regret. I want to send men, but I can't leave Winterfell undefended. If the Boltons crush us, the wall won't matter anyway, because there'll be no one left to support it. Yet if I ignore the wall, the others might sweep down unopposed. We need a united North, Sam. Then maybe we can rally the realm. Sam's eyes shone with concern. Then that's what we'll do. And I'll help however I can. Jon managed a small grin. What I need from you right now, Sam, is more of that reading, more gleaning from the old texts. Anything that might help us feed our people, fortify the castle, or negotiate alliances. You've always been the smartest one in the room. Sam blushed slightly but nodded with determination. I'll do my best. I promise. They spoke a while longer about details, where to set up an infirmary, how to re-establish the Ravenry, the possibility of sending for a new maester from the Citadel if the Crown's approval could ever be gained. Finally, Sam left to return to his tasks, leaving Jon alone once more. He felt a flicker of warmth, reminded that he was not alone in this burden. He had Sam, Mors, Alice, Dacey, Tormund, and the men who had fought by his side. They were far from perfect, but they were bound together by necessity and, for some, by loyalty to House Stark. As night fell fully, Jon forced himself to the maester's old chamber, now unoccupied, for a moment's rest. The chamber was small and plain, though it smelled of old parchment and dust. He sank onto a narrow cot, too tired to remove more than his boots and belt. Ghost settled near the doorway, ears perked for any intrusion. Darkness, pressed against the arrow-slit window. Jon's mind whirled with images. The White Walkers, a looming Bolton army, the memory of Ramsay's sneer, the quiet desperation in the eyes of men who looked to him for hope. Drained, he let his eyes close. Even in his exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. He dreamt of the crypts beneath Winterfell. He walked among the statues of the old Stark kings, each face carved with solemn grace. The corridors twisted on themselves, deeper than he remembered, and he felt a cold wind on his neck, as if the presence of something ancient and watchful followed him. Far ahead, he saw a flicker of torchlight, Robb's figure standing at a bend in the path, beckoning silently. Jon tried to hurry, but the floor became damp and slick, shadows stirring at the edges of his vision. The shapes of dire wolves and ravens flitted in the corners. When he finally reached the place where Robb had stood, there was only the statue of a dire wolf, muzzle parted in a snarl. From somewhere in the darkness came a whisper, "Winter is here." Jon shuddered awake, heart pounding. He blinked, disoriented, sweat chilling on his brow. Ghost was at his side, nudging him gently. Candlelight flickered from a sconce by the door, revealing that a young steward had entered, hesitant. The lad whispered, "Your Grace, I'm sorry to wake you, but Lady Alice said it was urgent." Jon rubbed his face. "How long did I sleep? 2 hours, maybe." Jon rose, slipping on his boots and gathering himself. His limbs felt leaden. "What is it?" The steward bobbed his head nervously. "A raven from White Harbor arrived. Lady Alice is waiting in the great hall." Jon's pulse quickened. Perhaps this was the answer they needed, the Manderly's decision. He followed the steward downstairs, emerging into the hall where a cluster of men and women stood near the dais, lit by torches and the blazing hearth. Alice Karstark was among them, along with Mors Umber and Defy Mormont. All looked grave. The tension in the air was palpable. As Jon approached, Alice turned with a letter in her hand, her expression impossible to read. "It's from Lord Wyman Manderly," she said, offering it to Jon. Jon took the parchment, scanning the lines. Lord Wyman's style was flowery, full of courtesies and flourishes, but the core of the message was plain. White Harbor remained cautious. Manderly acknowledged Jon's claim under Robb Stark's will, but also mentioned the Crown's recognition of Roose Bolton as Warden of the North. He wrote that he could not openly declare for Jon unless Jon could guarantee the defeat of House Bolton and the Lannisters' inability to retaliate. He also expressed concern that a war in the North would disrupt trade, leading to famine and ruin. Yet there was a glimmer of hope, a coded line about pies, which some said was Manderly's signature way of alluding to hidden intentions. The letter ended with an invitation. If Jon or his representatives traveled to White Harbor to treat with him, in person, perhaps an agreement could be reached. Jon lowered the parchment, frustration warring with understanding. Lord Wyman was playing his own game. He might well be outraged at the Boltons and the Freys for their part in the Red Wedding, but he wanted assurances. "He's not refusing," Jon said slowly, "but he's not committing. He wants a show of strength." Defy Mormont snorted. "And if we fail to prove that, he'll hand our heads to the Boltons?" Alice's brow furrowed. "Lord Wyman lost a son at the Red Wedding. I doubt he'll ever side with the Freys or the Boltons. But he's cautious. White Harbor has grown wealthy. He won't risk it all unless he believes you can truly hold the North." Mors scratched his beard, gaze flicking between the letter and Jon. "We can't bring an army to White Harbor just for a parley. But if we go with a small retinue, we risk being captured or forced into some humiliating compromise." Jon felt the heavy weight of the decision. White Harbor was crucial, yet traveling there in the dead of winter, with Bolton's forces looming, seemed madness. But if Manderly's forces and fleet joined him, the Boltons would be cornered. "I'll go," Jon decided at last. "White Harbor is too important. I'll take a small escort, show Manderly that I trust him, and negotiate in good faith. Meanwhile, the rest of you will remain here to defend Winterfell and continue gathering allies. If Roose Bolton moves, recall me at once." Alice pressed her lips together. "That's a risk, Your Grace." "Every choice here is a risk," Jon said, "but it's one I have to take. Manderly's thousands of men, and the harbor itself, could shift the balance." Mors crossed his arms, the leather of his jerkin creaking. "Then take enough men to keep you safe. At least 100. The roads will be treacherous. We can't have you ambushed." 100 men might put Lord Wyman on edge, Defy pointed out. "He might see it as a threat." Jon considered both arguments. "I'll bring a modest escort, no more than 20. That should be enough to deter bandits, but not enough to start a war. Let's select them carefully. A few knights, a few wildlings who know how to handle the cold, and some northern lords to show unity. I'll leave within 2 days. That gives me time to finalize matters here." The group nodded, each face somber. Defy added, "I'll wait for your instructions tonight, then set off for Bear Island in the morning. If all goes well, we'll link up in a few weeks, or whenever the seas allow." Jon nodded, resolved. For better or worse, the next step was clear. "Very well, let's prepare." They dispersed, off to make their arrangements. Alice lingered, glancing at Jon. "Be careful on the road, Your Grace. If Bolton learns you're traveling, he may not hesitate to strike." Jon nodded, meeting her gaze. "If he tries, we'll be ready." But inwardly, his heart pounded with apprehension. He remembered the journey he'd taken from Winterfell to the Wall as a boy, full of youthful excitement. Now that same road would be fraught with hidden foes and unrelenting cold. Still, better to face the unknown than to hide behind Winterfell's walls while the North starved for leadership. At last, the hall emptied, leaving only a few tired guards. Jon stood by the fire, absorbing its meager warmth. Thoughts swirled in his mind. The White Walkers, Roose Bolton, the uncertain loyalty of White Harbor. His responsibilities felt like a mountain perched on his shoulders. Across the flickering coals, Ghost's red eyes glowed. The direwolf stared back, a silent sentinel. Jon wondered if Ghost sensed the scale of the burdens to come. He moved to the dais, where the battered high seat of the Starks loomed, carving shadow shapes on the stone floor. He ran a hand over the worn wood. How many Starks had sat here before him, carrying the weight of the North on their shoulders? Aderian Stark, Jon recalled from old tales. Brandon the shipwright, Torrhen the king who knelt, Ned Stark, who left for King's Landing and never returned. Robb Stark, betrayed at the Red Wedding. Now Jon, a bastard turned king. He closed his eyes and offered a silent vow that he would not abandon these people, that he would fight for them with every breath left in his body. He could almost hear Ned's voice in the crackling flames. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, a reminder of duty, of the cost of leadership. Then, with a weary sigh, Jon strode from the hall to continue his preparations, each step echoing with a conviction forged from heartbreak and necessity. The North needed him, and he would do all he could. Rally them, protect them, and unite them, before the coming of a winter that promised to devour everything if they stood alone. The 2 days of preparation were a whirlwind. Jon oversaw the partial repair of Winterfell's battered fortifications, assigning laborers to reinforce gates and patch holes in the walls. He authorized a small group to scour the nearby countryside for any grain hidden away by fearful smallfolk. Scouts reported evidence of scattered Bolton outriders, but no massing army yet. It seemed Roose Bolton's main host remained to the south, near Moat Cailin, gathering strength. By night, Jon pored over old documents that Sam retrieved from the remains of the library. Details on trade routes, genealogies, accounts of alliances in centuries past. Some pieces might prove useful in negotiating with Lord Manderly. He scrawled letters in answer to lords he hoped might join his cause. Each word was carefully chosen, seeking to convey strength and legitimacy without stirring unnecessary alarm. Whenever he passed the crypt stairs, a pang of guilt and longing tugged at him. He needed to visit his father's tomb. He needed to confront the ghosts that haunted him. But each time, something pressed him away. A council meeting, a crisis with the wounded, or his own reluctance to see Ned Stark's stone visage again. Instead, he buried himself in the tasks at hand, forging ahead. Early on the second morning, Tormund's foraging party returned with ample wood and game strapped to the backs of horses. They boasted of outwitting a few scattered Bolton deserters in the wilderness. Tormund sauntered into the courtyard with a broad grin, calling out, "The south is soft, but this north is as cold as a giant's arse. Snow? At least we've got something to burn." Jon, grateful for the extra supplies, embraced Tormund as a friend. Then he explained his upcoming journey to White Harbor. Tormund scowled, insisting on accompanying Jon to guard against treachery, but Jon persuaded him to remain at Winterfell. "I need you here," Jon said. "You've commanded men before. Help Mors and Alice keep watch. If Bolton shows up at our doorstep, you'll need your wits and your axe to hold this castle." Tormund let out a disgruntled snort but relented. "Fine, but if you get yourself killed dealing with some fishlord, I'll never forgive you." Jon clapped his shoulder. "I'll do my best to stay alive, friend." By midday, the retinue was gathered in the courtyard. 20 riders in all, 10 knights or northern lords, 5 wildlings handpicked by Tormund for their skill in survival, 4 more men who had personal ties to White Harbor, and Jon himself. Ghost would accompany them, though the direwolf's presence made some uneasy. It was a small group traveling light and fast with a half-dozen pack horses for supplies. A hush settled over the gathered crowd as Jon checked his saddle straps. The wind carried flurries of snow, dusting mail and cloaks. Daisy Mormont, clad in her bearskin cloak, approached Jon to receive the sealed letter he'd promised for Bear Island. She would depart shortly, heading northwest with a few of her own warriors. "Good fortune to you, your grace," she said, bowing stiffly. "We'll meet again in blood or victory, whichever the gods will." "May it be victory," Jon replied. They clasped forearms. Then she turned to mount her horse, riding out with her men in a swirl of fur and hoofbeats. Mors Umber and Alice Karstark stood together by the gate, bidding Jon farewell. Mors seemed troubled, as though he wished he could be the one to ride with Jon. But it made more sense for him to stay and coordinate the Umber's arrival, to watch for Bolton. Alice, for her part, wore a cloak of gray wool, eyes shining with concern. "Be swift, your grace," she urged. "These are perilous roads." Jon nodded. "I'll return as soon as I can. If you ride for Carhold before I'm back, be careful. We can't afford to lose you. The North needs every loyal house." She offered a tight smile. "I'll come back with Karstark riders to bolster our cause, one way or another." With that, there was nothing more to say. Jon swung into his saddle. Ghost padded at the flank of his horse, restless but disciplined. The small column clattered out of Winterfell, passing through the great gate onto the snow-covered King's Road. The sky above was a dull steel gray. Crows cried in the distance. Jon glanced back once, seeing the banners of House Stark waving from the battlements. The place he had reclaimed with blood and iron. He was leaving it in uncertain hands while he sought to secure the Manderly's allegiance. A pang of worry beat in his chest, but he reminded himself it had to be done. With a silent vow, he turned his gaze southward, guiding his horse into the teeth of the wind. They made steady progress at first, though the snow was deep and the road ill-maintained. The nights were cold and bleak. They sheltered in abandoned farmsteads or among copses of pines, posting careful watches. Ghost ranged around their camp perimeter, a silent warden. Whenever Jon stood watch by moonlight, he thought of the others, their dead eyes gleaming in the dark. But they were too far south for that terror, at least for now. On the fourth day, they reached a shallow, half-frozen stream. A broken stone bridge forced them to cross carefully at a ford. Icy water surged around the horses' legs. That night, they sought refuge in the gutted remains of a holdfast that had been burned years before, possibly during the War of the Five Kings. The black timbers still smelled faintly of smoke. Jon had trouble sleeping, haunted by memories of how war had ravaged this land. He needed to end it to unify the North. But he also thought of Sam's words, of the unstoppable cold threat. Could any mortal king truly stand against it? Their progress slowed as they neared the fork in the road leading east toward White Harbor. The winds increased, howling over the plains. Drifts piled high, obscuring the path. They lost 2 horses to injuries. One stumbled in a hidden hole and broke its leg. Another grew lame from a twisted hoof. They butchered the first one for meat, a grim necessity. The wildlings spiced and smoked some of it over a smoky fire, joking bitterly that the Kneeler horses couldn't handle real winter. Still, every loss weakened their small party. On the 7th day, the storms lessened, revealing a landscape of rolling hills blanketed in white. They began to see isolated farmsteads again, and once even a traveling merchant huddled in a half-frozen wagon. He had little goods to offer, but recognized Jon from rumors, the king in the north, and insisted on giving him a tattered tapestry that depicted a dire wolf and a crescent moon. Jon tried to refuse, but the merchant saw it as a hopeful sign. "We want the wolves, not the flayed men," he said, spitting on the ground. That night, they made camp near an ancient oak. One of the men from White Harbor, Heward, a former caravan guard, claimed they were only a few days from the outskirts of the Manderly's territory. Jon took the first watch, sitting by a small fire. Ghost dozed at his feet, ears flicking. The rest of the riders wrapped themselves in cloaks, using saddles as pillows. The air was painfully cold. Stars glittered overhead. Jon's gaze wandered to the fire. Flames danced, gold and orange. He remembered Ygritte's bright hair, the warmth of her laughter, her presence in the icy wastes. He thought of all the people he had lost, all the choices that had led him here. Sometimes he wondered if there was another path, one where the realm united without bloodshed, where the others were defeated by a coalition of lords across Westeros. But that was a dream, and he'd learned how cruelly dreams could shatter. In the distance, a soft sound caught his ear, a rustling. Jon's hand drifted to the hilt of Longclaw. He peered into the darkness, heart thudding. Ghost stirred, muzzle lifting to sniff the air. The night seemed to hold its breath. Then, a faint shape emerged between the trunks of a few scraggly trees. Jon's grip tightened, but he forced himself to wait. A moment later, he saw it more clearly. A single figure, stumbling, cloak ragged and caked in frost. Whoever it was, they approached the glow of the campfire with slow caution. Jon rose, keeping his sword sheathed but his hand ready. "Halt!" he called quietly, not wanting to wake the entire camp yet. "State your name." The figure lifted a trembling hand, pushing back a hood. Firelight revealed a bruised face, lips blue with cold. It was a woman, hair lank and half-frozen. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. Ghost raised his head, sniffing at the air, not growling. Jon stepped closer, scanning the darkness for any sign of a trap. Seeing none, he beckoned to her. "Come to the fire." Slowly, she staggered forward, half collapsing near the flames. Jon crouched, carefully supporting her shoulders. Up close, he saw she was likely no more than 20, though hunger and cold had etched lines of desperation in her features. Her eyes were wide with terror. "Who are you?" Jon asked softly. "Are you alone?" She nodded, pressing trembling fingers to her lips. Don't kill me," she whispered. I fled them. Oh gods." Jon's brow furrowed. "Fled who?" Her gaze darted around, as though expecting an attack. "Men with flayed man banners. They burned our village, took the healthy men for their army, killed the rest. I ran. I've been hiding, trying to get anywhere. Bolton outriders or Bolton loyalists on a rampage." Jon's anger flared. Ghost moved closer, sniffing at the woman, then settling again. "You're safe here," Jon said, fighting to keep his voice gentle. "We're no friends of the Boltons." She blinked, not seeming to fully understand. Then one of Jon's companions stirred, noticing the newcomer. Soft mutters spread. A few gathered around, offering water and a scrap of bread. She devoured them eagerly, eyes watering. Gradually, they coaxed more details from her. The Boltons had a small band of raiders operating in the region, pressing villages for recruits and provisions. She hadn't seen Roose Bolton himself, but word was that he was amassing forces south of White Harbor, trying to intercept anyone loyal to the Starks. This news unsettled Jon's men. If Bolton's raiders had ventured this far east, they could be near White Harbor's domain already, strangling supply lines and terrorizing the small folk. Jon's jaw tightened. So this was how Roose Bolton waged war, through fear, abduction, and murder, a methodical terror campaign. He knelt beside the woman, who was now sipping weak ale from a flask someone had passed her. "Rest. We'll keep you warm, and in the morning, we'll see to your wounds," he promised. She looked at him with hollow gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured, then sank into a fitful sleep by the fire. One of the wildlings, a wiry man named Crag, draped his extra fur cloak over her. Jon stood, letting out a slow breath. Bolton was moving faster than he'd hoped. The impetus to reach White Harbor doubled. If Lord Wyman saw the havoc, perhaps he would be spurred to act sooner. Yet Jon also worried that these raids might terrify the Manderlys into further caution. The entire region could descend into chaos unless decisive action was taken. He resumed his watch, scanning the dark horizon. The frigid wind cut through his layers. His mind churned with fury at the suffering inflicted on innocent villagers. He remembered the letter he'd once read from Ramsay, mocking, threatening. Ramsay was dead, but the cruelty of House Bolton lived on through Roose and his loyalists. Not for long, Jon vowed under his breath, imagining the day they would root out the flayed man banner forever. The next morning, they gave the woman some spare clothes and a seat on one of their pack horses. She was too weak to walk, and her old boots were falling apart. She shyly thanked them, eyes still haunted, but her posture less panicked than before. The group continued east, forging through the snow, more vigilant than ever. Every thicket or copse could hide Bolton raiders. That afternoon, they spotted smoke on the horizon. Fearing another burned village, Jon led them cautiously forward. They soon came upon a small hamlet by a half-frozen stream, half of its huts reduced to charred ruins. A handful of villagers poked through the rubble, searching for salvageable items. Most looked up in alarm as Jon's group approached, only to break into soft gasps when they saw the direwolf sigils some of his men wore. "Starks," an older woman murmured, huddling near a collapsed roof. "Are we saved, then?" Jon swung down from his horse, looking at the wreckage. A boy's body lay near the remains of a pigsty, a crossbow bolt lodged in his back. Rage and sorrow twisted in Jon's gut. "When did this happen?" "Yestermorn," the woman croaked. "They came with the flayed man banner, took what livestock we had, demanded we join them or burn. Some men tried to fight. She trailed off, eyes drifting to the small corpse. "Then they left." Jon's fist clenched. "I'm sorry we weren't here sooner. If you can, gather those who remain and head for Winterfell. They'll shelter you." Another villager spat bitterly. "Winterfell? That's days away. And how do we know we'll fare any better on the road? The Boltons might catch us." Jon gently but firmly insisted, "I understand, but if you stay here, they'll return. Winterfell is no paradise right now, but it's safer than this. Tell them Jon Snow sent you, or King Jon if you prefer. You'll find some measure of safety behind those walls." A younger man with a torn cloak approached, sizing Jon up. "King Jon, is it? Then you best avenge us. These devils can't keep doing as they please." Jon gave a solemn nod. "I swear this will end. The Boltons will be driven out of the north." A flicker of hope passed over the man's grim features. Slowly, the villagers began gathering their meager belongings. Baskets, blankets, a couple of surviving goats. The woman from the night before climbed down from the horse, hobbling over to speak with them, sharing her own experiences. It seemed most of them decided to try for Winterfell together. At least safety in numbers gave them a chance. Jon and his retinue helped bury the bodies. None deserved to be left for crows. It was grim work in the frozen ground, but a necessary kindness. The mood was somber as they resumed their journey, leaving the villagers behind, forging onward to White Harbor. By dusk the next day, the landscape began to shift. The rolling hills flattened somewhat, and they saw scattered stands of trees. Heward pointed to the east. "We should be crossing into Manderly-held lands soon. We might come upon some outer holdfasts, places that pay taxes to White Harbor." Jon was relieved. Another day, maybe two, and they could be at Lord Wyman's gates. With luck, he would not turn them away. That night, the wind was eerily silent. The sky overhead was a tapestry of stars, and a waning moon cast a pale glow across the snow. Jon stood watch again, too restless to sleep. The hush of the night made him uneasy. He thought of the woman's story of the burned hamlet. Each memory fueled his resolve. The Bolton terror must be stopped. White Harbor was the key. Around midnight, Ghost stiffened, ears pricking. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Jon immediately went on alert. The others, sensing something amiss, roused themselves, hands on weapons. In the moonlight, they could see faint silhouettes cresting a ridge to the north. A cluster of riders. Armor glinted. One of Jon's men cursed under his breath. The shapes halted at the ridge, perhaps spotting Jon's camp. "Bolton riders?" someone muttered, fear in his tone. Jon squinted, counting. At least 10 or 15. Hard to tell in the shadows. They did not charge, but the tension was as sharp as a drawn blade. Then a horn echoed across the night. A single low note. The riders wheeled about, disappearing behind the ridge. Jon felt the adrenaline surge. "Mount up," he ordered quietly. "We can't stay here. If they're Bolton scouts, they'll bring reinforcements. We need to move." Quickly, they doused the small fire, packed essentials, and mounted. The horses snorted, stamping the snow. The terrified woman, now a bit stronger, clung to the saddle behind one of the men. Jon led them southeast, trying to put distance between themselves and the watchers on the ridge. There was no easy path in the dark, so they navigated by the moon and by Heward's knowledge of the local terrain. They rode hard for what felt like hours, hearts pounding, eyes scanning every shape in the dark. Once they heard distant hoofbeats, but it might have been a trick of the wind. At last, they came upon a frozen stream, partially reflecting the moonlight. The group crossed carefully, then continued until they found a small hollow with natural rock outcroppings that offered some concealment. There they huddled, breath steaming, bodies weary from the tension. Jon spoke in low tones. "We can't outrun them if they have fresh mounts, but maybe we've lost them. Come dawn, we push straight for White Harbor. If we can reach Manderly's domain, the Boltons won't dare attack openly." One of the wildlings spat. "Cowardly flayers. They like to kill and run. I say we face them." Jon shook his head. "We can't risk losing half our men before reaching White Harbor. We can't risk them capturing me or any of us. We must keep going." No one argued. They settled in for what remained of the night, too uneasy to sleep, keeping triple watch. Jon's mind replayed the glimpse of those riders on the ridge. He pictured Bolton men clad in dark leathers, holding torches or crossbows, waiting in ambush. He gripped Longclaw's hilt, telling himself he was prepared if it came to bloodshed. But one misstep and all could be lost. At last, gray morning arrived, revealing a land painted in pale light. Clouds gathered to the west, threatening more snow. Jon's party set off quickly, urging their horses onward. The half-frozen ground crunched under hooves. Around midday, Heward halted at a small rise and pointed. In the distance, a wooden palisade encircled a modest holdfast near a bend in a river. "That belongs to a petty lord sworn to House Manderly," Heward explained. "We might find shelter there, or at least glean news." They approached cautiously, banners visible to declare themselves. A watchman on the palisade called out, "Who goes?" "Jon Snow," Jon replied, raising his voice. "I come seeking passage to White Harbor." There was a moment of tense silence. Then the gates creaked open, revealing a few men with the trident sigil of House Manderly sewn on their cloaks. Their leader, a grizzled man with a scar across his nose, eyed Jon's party warily. "Jon Snow, the one folk call the king in the north?" Jon nodded. "Aye." The guards studied them, noticing the mix of wildlings and knights, the battered horses. Then he shrugged. "We heard rumors you took Winterfell. Had no idea you'd come this far east. Enter if you mean no harm." They led Jon's group inside. The holdfast was simple. Wooden huts around a courtyard. A stone keep that looked more like a fortified tower than a grand castle. They were greeted by a minor lordling named Ser Harry's Longwood, a middle-aged knight with thinning hair and kind eyes. He listened attentively as Jon explained his mission to reach White Harbor and parley with Lord Wyman. Ser Harry's nodded gravely. "We've had word from White Harbor to expect you, in a manner of speaking. Lord Wyman told all his loyal bannermen to be on watch for travelers from Winterfell. But I didn't expect you'd come by so small a company." Jon forced a smile. "A larger company would have been too conspicuous." "How far are we from White Harbor?" 2 days' ride, if the roads hold. Less if you push hard. But there are Bolton patrols in the region. Some of our outriders clashed with them a week ago. Be wary." Jon's stomach sank at the confirmation. "We'll do our best to avoid them." He paused. "Will you offer us shelter for the night?" Ser Harry's agreed readily. "Any friend of House Stark is welcome here. We have little to share, but what we have is yours." Grateful, Jon and his men stabled the horses, then found themselves in a cramped feast hall where a steaming stew of barley and onions was served. It wasn't sumptuous, but it was far better than the dried rations they'd been living on. Jon thanked Ser Harry's for his hospitality, and the two spoke long into the evening. The local lord fretted about how White Harbor might respond to the Bolton threat. He lamented the chaos that had seized the North since Ned Stark's death. "We used to know our place in the world," he sighed. "Now everything is turned upside down." Jon laid out his intentions, explaining that his priority was to unite the North, end Bolton tyranny, and prepare for the winter threat from beyond the wall. Ser Harry's listened sympathetically but also seemed anxious, torn between loyalty to House Manderly and fear of a wider war. "Lord Wyman is a good man," he said, "but you'll need to persuade him that the risk is worth it, that the Lannisters won't send an army to burn White Harbor in retaliation." Jon knew that fear all too well. The Lannisters still held the Iron Throne. They could dispatch royal forces or more likely funnel support to the Boltons. "We'll handle that," Jon said, though he was not entirely sure how. "I ask you only to stand by your oaths. Support your liege lord if he chooses to declare for House Stark." Ser Harry's nodded, troubled. "I will. I pray the day never comes when I have to fight my own neighbors. But I cannot stomach the flayed man." That night, Jon finally had a secure enough bed to snatch a few hours of unbroken sleep. He dreamt again of the crypts, but this time he saw Bran, walking away down the dark corridor, leaving Jon alone. He awoke with a gasp, the images lingering in his mind. The emptiness of the crypts pressed on his heart. He resolved that once he returned to Winterfell, he would make his peace with the dead. But for now, he pushed the dream aside. They departed early in the morning, after Ser Harry's provided them with fresh-baked bread and a few spare arrows. He advised them of a route that might bypass Bolton patrols, a series of narrow trails cutting through wooded terrain. It would be slow, but hopefully safer. The first day went smoothly. The snow thinned slightly as they descended into lower elevations. They made camp by a small lake, ringed by ice at the edges. The second day, they pressed on, hearts lifting at the thought that White Harbor was within reach. By midday, they emerged from the woods onto a broad track that led east, flanked by farmland. The land sloped gradually downward toward the distant glimmer of water. The White Knife River, Jon realized, which led to the city and port. Yet as they rounded a bend, their hopes collided with grim reality. A column of smoke rose from a set of houses near the road, flames licking at thatched roofs. Figures on horseback milled about, some carrying torches, others shouting. Even from a distance, Jon recognized the flayed man banner. A surge of white-hot fury coursed through him. Bolton raiders were sacking a small hamlet in broad daylight. The thought of riding past without interference was abhorrent. But they were a mere 20 riders, and the Boltons appeared to number at least 30, possibly more. Heward muttered a curse. The woman they'd saved clung to her horse, trembling. Jon breathed heavily, scanning the scene. They had the element of surprise, at least for a moment. The Boltons might not expect a determined attack from so few. "We can't let them slaughter these people," Jon hissed. "And if we wait for them to leave, they'll do more harm elsewhere." One of the wildlings bared his teeth. "Then let's kill them." Jon debated quickly in his mind. Every instinct demanded he protect the villagers, strike at Bolton's men. But they were outnumbered. Did they have a choice? If they retreated, the raiders would continue unopposed. White Harbor was near, help might be found. But by the time they fetched it, these Boltons would be gone. He remembered the burned hamlet, the crossbow bolt in the boy's back. A steely resolve took hold. They would fight. They had capable warriors, and many of Bolton's men were likely scattered in the act of looting. Surprise and righteous fury could tip the balance. "Form up," Jon ordered, turning to his riders. "We hit them hard and fast. No mercy for those who burn innocents. Let's show them what the wolf stands for." The men set their jaws, checking weapons and armor. One night, Ser Arwood drew his sword with a grim smile. "For the Starks," he said. The rest echoed the sentiment. Jon glanced at Ghost, who stood poised, muscles tense. Then he kicked his horse into a gallop, leading the charge. They thundered down the slope, hoofs pounding. The Boltons heard them too late, turning in confusion. Some were on foot, rummaging through houses, while others loitered near the road. Jon shouted, voice carrying over the din, and the men behind him took up the battle cry. Ghost streaked ahead, a white blur in the snow. The first clash was brutal. Jon's sword cleaved into a Bolton soldier who barely had time to raise his shield. A wildling hurled a spear, impaling another. The riders carved through the scattered raiders, who reeled in shock. Women and children cowered behind burning structures, screaming. The crackle of flames merged with the clash of steel. A few Boltons scrambled onto horses, trying to form a defense. More than half of them seemed to break in panic, unused to facing determined knights and wildlings united under the Stark banner. Ghost ripped into a man who wore no helm, blood spraying across the snow. Jon wheeled his horse around, parrying a wild slash from a Bolton swordsman. Their blades met with a shriek of metal. Jon elbowed the man in the face, sending him reeling, then drove Longclaw through his chest. He spotted an older soldier rallying some of his fellows near the smoldering stable. They were trying to regroup, crossbows in hand. Down! Jon shouted, ducking low. Bolts whizzed overhead. One found a target in a wildling's leg, dropping him from the saddle. Jon spurred his horse forward, slicing into the crossbowmen before they could reload. In the maelstrom, he felt a glancing blow on his shoulder, but adrenaline numbed the pain. His men fought fiercely, fueled by righteous anger. The outnumbered Bolton soldiers, caught in disarray, quickly lost their nerve. Some tried to flee on foot, discarding weapons. Others begged for mercy. A few kept fighting until they were cut down. Within minutes, the raid was broken. Bodies littered the ground among the burning huts, the snow stained red. Jon reined in his horse, breathing raggedly. Ghost's maw dripped crimson, the direwolf's flanks heaving. The stench of charred wood and blood was thick. One of Jon's riders had fallen, a knight from a lesser house, a crossbow bolt lodged in his throat. Another lay groaning on the ground, shot in the gut. The woman who had joined them crouched behind a collapsed fence, unharmed but pale as death. Villagers peered out from hiding, eyes wide with disbelief. They saw the direwolf sigil and realized that this was no random band of mercenaries. Many dropped to their knees, sobbing or offering thanks. Jon dismounted, instructing his men to see to the wounded, gather the living prisoners, and stamp out the fires if possible. A handful of Bolton survivors had thrown down arms. They knelt in the snow, trembling. Jon approached them, Longclaw still in hand. One of them, a young man, stared at Jon with terror. "We were only following orders," he whimpered. "He forced us. Roose Bolton forced us." Jon's voice trembled with suppressed wrath. "Tell that to the children you burned." He glanced around at the huts, fresh flames crackling. "Your crimes are beyond forgiveness." The young man wept, snot dripping from his nose. "Mercy, please." Jon remembered Ned Stark's words about the man who passes the sentence swinging the sword. He clenched his teeth. He'd promised to judge men by their deeds, not their forced loyalties. But these men had just set fire to homes with people inside. With no trial and no time for pretense, Jon saw no redemption here. Carefully, he lifted Longclaw. "For the North," he said quietly, and ended the man's life with a swift stroke. The other prisoners met the same fate. Their bodies joined the rest in the bloody snow. Jon stood, panting, staring at the carnage. Was this justice or vengeance? Perhaps the difference was too fine a line in war. But he felt no triumph, only a sick sorrow. The wounded wildling cried out in pain, and some of the others rushed to aid him. One of the villagers clutched the body of a child, the expression on her face hollow. They had come too late to save everyone. They salvaged what they could. The hamlet's survivors, only a handful, were directed to follow them toward White Harbor, if they dared, or to find refuge with nearby kin. The fires were contained but had already consumed most of the structures. Another of Jon's men succumbed to an arrow wound. They buried him swiftly, marking the grave with a rough cairn of stones. The living had to move on. When they finally set out again, the mood was grim. The woman they'd rescued earlier stared at the ground, as though consumed by her memories of horror. Jon's men rode with stiff backs and blood-soaked gear. If they needed any further proof that Roose Bolton had to be stopped, they had it now, etched in the flames and the dead. The next morning, the walls of White Harbor appeared on the horizon, a welcome sight despite the gloom. Stark banners did not fly there yet. Only the mermen of House Manderly, rippling in a frigid wind. Jon felt a surge of relief that they had reached the Manderly city, battered but alive. The travelers who accompanied them, refugees from Bolton Terror, hovered uncertainly, unsure if they'd be admitted. Jon urged his horse forward. The city gates were large and well-guarded. White Harbor was unique in the north, a bustling port settlement with walls of pale stone. Even in winter, some trade endured, though diminished. The guards demanded their names and business. Jon declared himself once more. Jon Snow, king in the north, come to treat with Lord Wyman Manderly. The guards exchanged glances. One gestured to a captain, who hurried off to deliver the news. They waited in the crisp morning air while the gates remained shut. A hush of tension settled. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the gates groaned open. A knight in Manderly colors rode out with a retinue of 10 men. He addressed Jon politely but guardedly. Lord Wyman invites you inside, but your escort must remain small, yourself and a chosen few. The rest can be quartered in the outer ward. Jon exchanged looks with his companions. I'll take 4 with me, he said. 1 is a maesterly sort, Samwell Tarly, and 2 are knights. The last is my steward. I trust that is acceptable. The Manderly knight inclined his head. Very well. You'll be treated with courtesy, by Lord Wyman's orders. Jon signaled Sam, Ser Arwood, who had survived the skirmish unharmed, another knight, and the steward from Winterfell. The others remained outside, along with Ghost, who refused to leave Jon's side. The knight eyed the direwolf uneasily, but when Jon insisted, they allowed Ghost to enter, albeit with evident anxiety. Then, at last, Jon passed through the towering gates, entering White Harbor. The city within was subdued by winter's grip. Streets were lined with snowdrifts, and the harbor waters had an icy rim. Still, signs of life endured. Fisher, men hauling nets, blacksmiths hammering in dim forges, merchants bundling up against the cold. As Jon's group rode through the streets, people stared, some whispering. They saw the blood on the riders' cloaks, the haggard exhaustion on their faces. Some recognized the direwolf sigil. A few cheered softly, others backed away in caution. The castle of Newcastle loomed ahead, perched by the harbor. It was an imposing structure of stone with thick walls. Banners of the Merman sigil hung from its towers. Crossing a drawbridge over an icy moat, Jon and his small escort entered the courtyard, dismounting under the watchful gaze of dozens of guards. The Manderly knight led them into a great hall lit by torches and a large hearth. Tapestries depicting maritime scenes draped the walls. A sweet, fish-laden smell clung to the air. White Harbor was famous for its seafood and pies. At the far end of the hall sat Lord Wyman Manderly, an immense man, thick of neck and limb, with a great gray-white beard. He wore a rich doublet emblazoned with the merman. To one side stood several advisors and guards, and behind him was a table laden with platters of bread, fish, and steaming soup. Lord Wyman's eyes narrowed as he studied Jon's approach. His expression was not unkind, merely cautious and curious. Jon stopped a respectful distance away. He inclined his head, though he did not kneel. Lord Wyman, I come to you as the king in the north, named so by Robb Stark's will and by the blood I shed to reclaim Winterfell from the Boltons. I seek your aid against Roose Bolton's tyranny and the threat that looms over all the north. Manderly rested his thick hands on the arms of his chair. He regarded Jon with a solemn, discerning gaze, then spoke, his voice deep and resonant. Jon Snow, or should I say Jon Stark, we have heard many tales of your deeds. Some call you an oathbreaker who abandoned the Night's Watch. Others name you a hero who saved the realm from wildlings. And now, they say you wear a crown. He stroked his beard. "Tell me, which are you?" Jon met his gaze evenly. "A man who does what he must for the north. The wall still stands, and I will aid it again if I can. But the Boltons are ravaging our land, and the White Walkers gather in the far north. To fight them, we must stand united, Stark and Manderly, Umber and Karstark, and every house that remembers its true loyalty." Silence stretched for a moment. Lord Wyman's belly rose and fell with a heavy sigh. He looked around at his advisors, then back at Jon. "You know what the Iron Throne says, that Roose Bolton is the Warden of the North by royal decree. To defy him is to defy the crown. White Harbor would face retribution. My city, my people, we would suffer mightily." Jon glanced at the table of food, recalling the half-starved villagers, the burned hamlets. They already suffer. The Boltons spare no one who does not kneel. And how long before they turn their cruelty on White Harbor or demand more taxes and men? The Red Wedding proved their treachery. There can be no lasting peace under their banner. Lord Wyman's jaw tightened at the mention of the Red Wedding. He took a moment to choose his words. "You speak truths I do not deny, but you must also prove you can protect us when the crown or the phrase come calling. We've faced betrayal enough." Jon's voice gentled. "My lord, I know your losses. My brother Robb loved your sons. One was slain at the Red Wedding. I would not have you lose more kin. But we must act, or the Boltons' terror will only grow." Wyman's gaze flickered with an old, simmering anger. "Yes," he said softly. "The phrase served me my own son in a pie, or so I suspect. They think I do not know. But oh, I remember." His eyes flashed. "Vengeance is a dish best served cold, they say, and winter is very cold indeed. Yet revenge alone is not enough. I must ensure White Harbor endures. So tell me, King Jon, how do you propose we stand against the might of the crown and the cunning of Roose Bolton?" Jon straightened, the reflection of the hearth dancing on his armor. "We gather the North, the Umbers, the Karstarks who remain loyal, the Mormonts, the Glovers, and more. We cast out the Boltons. The Lannisters may send troops, but we are far from King's Landing, and winter is on our side. The snows will hamper any southern invasion. Meanwhile, we must also prepare for a greater threat, one that will not bend to crowns or sigils. The White Walkers are real. Their whites roam beyond the wall. If we fail to unite now, none of us will survive the long night." Manderly studied Jon's face for a time, as if probing for any sign of falsehood. Then he shifted his bulk forward. "You speak as though you have stared into the face of these White Walkers." "I have," Jon said, voice trembling with memory. "I've seen what they can do. The living must stand together." A hush hung in the air. Manderly's advisors exchanged murmurs. The Lord drummed his fingers on the chair. Finally, he gestured to the table of food. "Come sit. Eat with me. We'll speak further. I would hear more of your battles beyond the wall, and how you retook Winterfell from Ramsay. And I would measure the man you are, beyond rumor." Jon inclined his head in acceptance. He and his companions approached the table, and servants rushed to bring additional chairs. Ghost settled warily at Jon's feet, nose twitching at the scent of fish. Lord Wyman poured wine with his own hand, a sign of courtesy, and offered the first cup to Jon. "Let us share salt and bread," he said, "as the old custom demands." Jon took a piece of bread, dipped it in salt, and ate. Symbolically, Lord Wyman did the same. It was a gesture of guest right, a tradition in the North ensuring no harm would come under one's roof. As the fish stew was served, Jon recounted the fall of Ramsay Bolton, the retaking of Winterfell, and the letters he'd received from the Night's Watch about the spreading threat of the undead. He spoke plainly, acknowledging the precarious position they all faced. Samwell, at Jon's request, added details from old records about the Long Night and the mysteries of dragonglass and Valyrian steel. Lord Wyman listened, occasionally stroking his beard, occasionally questioning, testing the logic behind Jon's claims. The meal stretched on, but by its end, Jon sensed that Manderly's initial reserve was thawing. The Lord seemed genuinely moved when Jon recounted the innocent villagers burned by Bolton raiders and the horrors inflicted on the small folk. Manderly's love for the people of the North, especially for those under his rule, shone through in his sharp questions and thoughtful expression. At last, Lord Wyman set aside his goblet and regarded Jon carefully. "I can see that you are not a mere boy from the wall. You bear yourself with the gravity of a Stark. Perhaps your father's blood runs strong in you, bastard name or no. The Boltons have indeed plagued us long enough. And for all the Crown's decrees, the Lannisters have no love for White Harbor. They sneer at those in the north, treat us like beggars. Meanwhile, the Boltons kill our people and call it law." He steepled his fingers. "I will tell you this, White Harbor is not defenseless. We have a respectable fleet, though the Bay of Seals can be treacherous in winter. We have men enough to fill these walls and more. If I were to declare for you openly, I would do so with all the might of House Manderly. Yet I am no fool. War with the Crown or the Boltons could mean a siege here. The city could starve. My people could be slaughtered like your villages. So I must ask, if I bend the knee to you, will you promise to protect White Harbor? To stand with us should the Lannisters send an army, or the Freys decide to strike?" Jon met his gaze firmly. "I will. If I am king in the north, then I protect all of the north, Winterfell, White Harbor, Bear Island, the smallest hamlet. I will not let your city fall alone. We will fight side by side." Manderly stared a moment longer, measuring. Then he let out a heavy breath. "And what of your plan to confront Roose Bolton? Will you march on him immediately? How shall we coordinate with the other houses?" Jon explained briefly. "Gather at Winterfell, draw Bolton out, or threaten the Dreadfort. Possibly a two-pronged campaign if the Mormonts and others could strike from the west." Manderly nodded slowly, thoughtful. "I'll need time to muster my men, gather provisions, and plan for a siege, in case the battle does not go our way. But if we act swiftly, we might catch Bolton before he unites all the lesser houses by fear." Jon almost allowed himself a small smile. "Then you agree to join us?" Manderly studied the wine in his goblet. "I have lost much to the Freys and Boltons. I have bided my time, but the hour for vengeance and justice has come. You have proven your resolve, and I see no better hope for restoring the Stark name to rightful rule. I will stand with you, King Jon, if you truly intend to free the North from these flayers and unify us against the threat beyond the wall." He lifted his gaze to Jon's, eyes bright with conviction. The merman bows to the wolf. Emotion caught in Jon's throat. This was the alliance he had prayed for. He inclined his head in gratitude. "You have my thanks, Lord Wyman. Together we will see the Boltons cast down. And then we will prepare for the winter to come." Manderly pushed his bulk to his feet, summoning a servant. "We shall draft the official documents of alliance. I will write to my bannermen, call them to arms. In a fortnight, perhaps less, we will march or sail for Winterfell. The snows may slow us, but I will not let the Boltons ravage the land unchallenged." He offered a plump hand to Jon. Jon rose and clasped it firmly, sealing the pact. The hall's tension softened. The rest of Jon's party exhaled in relief. Sam smiled, a gleam of excitement in his eyes. The path was still perilous, but this was a vital step. White Harbor's loyalty meant the difference between a scattered rebellion and a unified northern front. Ghost rose on all fours, tail swishing. Jon patted his direwolf, feeling the weight of events settle upon him. A formal alliance with House Manderly, a promise of men and ships, the commitment to face Roose Bolton head-on. Lord Wyman gestured for more wine, instructing servants to bring forth a celebratory feast. "We shall eat well tonight in honor of the new king in the north," he proclaimed. Cheers rose from those gathered, though overshadowed by the knowledge that war lay ahead. Jon could not entirely quell the swirl of worry in his heart. There was so much to do and time was short. Bolton's raiders roamed, the White Walkers stirred, and the Lannisters might yet intervene. But for now, hope flickered in a place where despair had once held sway. Jon allowed himself a moment to breathe, to accept a cup of Lord Wyman's wine, to meet Sam's relieved smile. The old gods only knew what trials awaited them in the coming weeks, but at least here, in the torchlit hall of White Harbor, a spark of unity was kindled. Winter was here, but the North was remembering who it was and who it could be under a Stark. And so, as the night wore on, Jon Snow, bastard, sworn brother, oathbreaker, and king, looked toward the horizon of a tomorrow fraught with danger, but also the promise of a North rising once again, loyal to the direwolf banner, braced to meet whatever darkness might descend.